Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to another Blender Hangouts. My name is Brandon Hicks. I'm a Blender Foundation certified trainer, and you are watching the Friday night stream. So let's get into it. Tonight is an awesome night. We are going to be talking about animation in Blender. This is going to wrap up our third live stream this week for absolute beginners in Blender. And so if you want to watch those are all on my YouTube channel. And of course, I talked a little bit with one of the other guild members this afternoon. I'm also going to make those available very easily to members of the Orange Guild, which is our training platform. So you'll be able to access those without having to go to YouTube in the future. Before we get started, one thing I want to say tonight is I'm having a little bit of an allergy problem. So if I have to pause and take some drinks or blow my nose or something like that, please pardon me ahead of time. But I'll try to keep it under control for you guys tonight. Okay, so let's jump quickly into Photoshop, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas about animation before we jump into tonight's stream. Okay, so let me get this up for you guys. Pull my screen over so you can see what is happening. Okay, so rearrange everything here. A little discombobulated tonight, but that's all right. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about with animation is the idea of keyframes. So keyframes are defined as snapshots in time for all parts of a moving object. And this is kind of my definition for how to easily think about keyframing in 3D. So whether we're talking about 2D animation or 3D animation, keyframing is nothing new. It's been used all the way back since the beginning of animation on paper, and then in the movies for Disney and things like that. And basically all we're doing with keyframes is we're defining moments in time of key things that are happening with our objects that are moving around in our scenes. So characters that are going to be taking actions, throwing baseballs or chasing people or jumping around or whatever they're doing, we have to define the most extreme positions of how they appear on screen so that we can create the illusion of movement, okay? And it's a little bit different when we get into 3D animation. We're still using keyframes to create the movement, but the computer is going to help us kind of with the in-between motions. And I'll get a little bit more into that as we get into animation tonight in Blender. But for right now, just remember that keyframes are kind of the way to masterfully control and puppeteer anything that you would want to animate in 3D. So you're going to have to be getting in the mindset of creating positions throughout the animation that define what the object is doing. And that's what keyframes are. Let's talk a little bit about something called the 12 principles of animation. Now, I'm not going to get into what everything means here. I'm not going to do a master's class right now on what this is, but I want to mention this because it's really something that's important if you're just starting to get into animation to go look up online. And I can recommend a book for you guys. It's The Illusion of Life, and it has the original animators from Disney's original 9 that walk through all of these 12 principles and what they mean and how to use them. And it's from the standpoint of, Snow White and Pinocchio and all of those movies that were in the classic golden age of Disney. And they talk about what they all mean and how to use them to great effect. So as we get into learning more and more advanced aspects of animation, if you want to take things to the next level, you need to start here with the 12 principles of animation. And this will help you really start to polish things up and get it to a level that feels professional, okay? So the only thing we're gonna talk about tonight is really timing in terms of how to position keyframes around, because timing, as you can imagine, is kind of an important part of animating. But all of these other things are equally important in terms of getting realistic, lifelike motion. And I'm gonna use the term lifelike more because Disney animation isn't realistic, but it feels like it has a lot of life because they exaggerate and they know how to use these 12 principles to great effect. So that's it for the lecture part of tonight's live stream, but I wanted to quickly share with you guys what keyframes are so you guys can keep that in your mind and also the 12 principles of animation, so you guys can look that up on your own. Just Google this. There's a great Wikipedia entry that talks about the book, The Illusion of Life, by Ollie Johnson, and all of these principles, and you can purchase that on Amazon. Okay, let me switch back to Blender here really quickly, and I'll show you guys kind of what I've been working on. Okay. So Lorian was asking The Illusion of Life by, and the name is Ollie Johnson, and he was one of the original Disney animators, Ollie Johnson, Johnsson. And I think he co-authored it with another person, but I don't remember. So there's only one book called The Illusion of Life, so it's pretty hard to mistake it for something else, but look that up. Okay, let's talk about what we're doing tonight in Blender. I'm gonna close some of my windows here so we're not keeping everything open. Okay, so I'm gonna show you guys a little bit of an animation that I created tonight. Sorry about that. And then we're going to get into how we can go about achieving some of that and render that out, okay? So let me pull open this little movie that I rendered out. And pause this, and we'll just kind of step through this really quickly. So this is about 100 frames of animation, and as I scrub through this, you can kind of see what we're going to be creating tonight. So we have a really simple scene where the sun is rising and then setting, and then the moon's coming up and the stars are coming out. Bear in mind, as we start learning these principles, we're not going for realistic, so kind of put that out of your mind in terms of if you're a little OCD about that. You need to learn the basics and the principles of how things work, and then you can go back and focus on making things perfect. But I just want to show you how you can start playing with these things without getting overwhelmed. So that's kind of what we're going to focus on tonight. So this is a little animation we're going to create, and you'll be able to render this on your own system by the end of this evening if you follow along. I'm going to get out of that and kind of show you what we're going to do here. Okay, so I made a few changes here to the scene, and I'm going to rearrange my desk a little bit here because my tablet is no longer needed. Okay, so as you'll see here, I basically rearranged some of the trees and I scaled some of them down. And you'll notice as we get further away towards the background over here, I scaled the trees really, really small. And what that's going to do as we look through the camera is give the illusion that we have a lot of distance here. And so this is kind of a really easy hack that you can use for your scenes to kind of create the illusion of distance. And this will save you some time. And I actually also utilized this on this 3D illustration that you see back here to create all of these trees, to shrink those down. And so that was the same idea, but with particles. So it's kind of interesting. Okay, so I'm going to quickly render this and show you where we ended up, because there's really not a lot of difference from last night. You can still see that it's taken a little bit of time, even though we're only at 20% width and height, and that's kind of slowing down, and I'm going to show you some ways to speed this up a little bit. You'll also notice it's kind of noisy in here, and so we'll try to fix some of that up as well. So the first thing we want to do is kind of simplify the process as we get in here and animate. We need to decide what we want to do, and we need to figure out the easiest way to go about doing that, so we're not going to get overwhelmed trying to maintain and manage the scene, okay? So the first thing I want to do is kind of optimize all my settings. So one of the things I want to make sure is I'm happy with all the positioning. Stars are behind, moon is in front. We've got our custom world that we created still back here. And I'm actually going to change things up a little bit to make the animation a little simpler to maintain tonight. So to get started, what I'm going to do is actually get rid of that world that we created using that plugin from last night. I'm just going to hit X right here, and then I'm going to create a new world just like this. So we need to make this color sort of a bluish, sky blue color like this. and then let's sort of preview this render. If you want to quickly switch that preview on and off when you're looking through your camera, you can hit Shift and Z on your keyboard. So let me turn on the keyboard shortcuts down here. So Shift Z will turn this on and off. And remember that we're using that border rendering here that I've enabled under the render options. So with this off, it's going to try to render everything in the background, which we don't want because it's going to use up extra memory. So we'll check this off, and now it's just going to render everything inside the camera view. So that's kind of what we're ending up with right now. And we need to decide if we're kind of happy with where everything is right now. Now remember, this should be sort of a nighttime scene to begin with. And so we don't want to make this look like daylight. We want to make this kind of look like the nighttime sort of scene. So I'm going to darken or up the saturation of this blue. I'm going to darken it up quite a bit. Oh, and it looks like I accidentally selected the sun instead of the world. So let's go back to the world over here. This is what we need to change. There we go. So we'll start with something like a dark navy on this background color, and we'll keep the strength at 1 right here. So this is our starting point. This is where we want to end up in our animation, okay? So one of the other things I want to make sure I do is position the moon kind of where I want it to be in the sky when it's all said and done. And it's best not to like directly center things compositionally if you can avoid it. So I always like to, pull the moon or the sun or anything in the middle of the frame off to one side so that we're paying attention to the rule of thirds. And so there we go. And now we can start kind of animating. So what I want to do is, again, recreate that animation. And I want to have the sun rising through the sky and then setting. And then I want to have the moon rise, and then I want to have the stars come in, okay? And so we need to figure out how we're going to animate all of this stuff. And so let's start really simple. We're going to create sort of our lighting setup that we had before we created this little world using that plugin. And so if you remember, we had a sun lamp in the background that we also use. If I turn on this extra layer 3 back here, and I'm gonna switch over to where I can see this. And what I wanna do is I wanna position, just for my organizational of the scene here, I wanna position this sort of in the same position as the moon. So I'm just gonna drag this up to where it's sort of in the middle of this right here. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna do a parent, like we talked about in another stream. So I'm gonna right click on the sun light, and then you're gonna shift right click on the sun or the moon in this case. And then I'm gonna hit Control P for parents. And I'm gonna select Object Keep Transform, okay? And that means now, wherever we move the sun or the moon, the lamp is gonna follow it. Now remember, positionally, it doesn't really matter where we place the sun lamp in the scene, because it only matters how we rotate this, okay? So even though this is gonna be moving, it's really not gonna have an effect unless we also rotate this. And I'll kind of show you what I mean as we start to animate. But the first thing we need to do is decide what we're gonna animate first, right? And so the easiest thing would be moving the sun through the sky in a sort of arc, like we talked about sort of last night. And so I'm gonna start by taking the moon in this particular case, and I wanna work backwards a little bit to save myself some trouble, because we already have the scene looking like nighttime, right? And so I don't wanna have to change all the colors around and make it look like daytime and then go forwards again to make it look like nighttime. Let's just start at the end of the animation and work our way backwards. And this should be pretty easy. So what I'm gonna do is, this will be the last position of the moon in the sky. So what we wanna do is, let's go ahead and grab our settings over here for our animation range. And I wanna start on frame 1, and I wanna end on frame, let's say 100, okay? And for tonight, we're just gonna think about the animation in terms of 0% to 100%. We're not gonna worry about 24 frames a second, 30 frames a second, any of that kind of stuff, because we're just gonna be talking about basics, okay? So just think about it of here the animation is 0% complete, here the animation is 100% complete. Okay, so we're gonna start at 100 over here. So we have a question in the chat. Lauren's asking, the lamp just designates the position of the shadows. And that's correct. So if we look at our render here, let me create 2 windows here so we can kind of visualize this a little bit easier. I'm going to select the sun here so you can see this. As we start rendering over here, even if I move this, you can notice nothing's updating in terms of shadow positions or anything like that on the left. Okay, so the angle of the sun in the sky is not changing, which is why nothing's updating over here. But the second we start rotating this, you can see those shadows start to update in the scene. And so you have to remember, sunlight is a directional lamp. That means direction is the only attribute that Blender pays attention to as far as how it is affecting the scene, okay? So that means no matter what scale it is, no matter what position it has in the sky, doesn't change anything. And that's why we had to create this object to represent the moon or the sun, because Blender only uses the direction of this lamp. It doesn't actually render that in our scene here. So if I hide this moon, there is no moon anymore because this lamp won't show up, even though it's right here. Okay. Hope that makes sense, and it probably will as we talk a little bit more about how to animate this. Okay, so let me pull this over a little bit. It's good to kind of play with your workflow here as far as your layouts for what you're going to do. There's all of these presets for how to rearrange your screen that you can use. I like to kind of customize my screen as I go, but these are here for you to play with. So if you want to go to 3D view or animation, there's all these windows that are just for animation, motion tracking. So all of these are specifically set up for whatever you're doing in Blender. So I'm going to go back to default here, which is going to remember whatever I did last to rearrange the screen. Now let's talk about how to start animating. So we have our sun or moon object here, and in this case, it's going to be the same thing. So I'm just going to call this sun and then underscore moon, because we're going to use the same object for that. And I want to start animating with the idea in mind that this is the last position the moon is in before. So the moon has already risen and it's up in the sky, okay? So what we want to start animating is the z-axis of the moon, because we're just going to raise this up and down to have it rise, okay? So the only number we have to play with keyframing is this z number, z coordinate right here. So we're going to right click this and we're going to insert a single keyframe on just the z axis channel, okay? Remember, we're on frame 100 to do this. And now what we're going to do is move back to frame 90, and we're going to drop the moon down below the horizon. And looking through the camera, I can tell that it's under right about there, okay? So now we can keyframe this again. I'm going to right click and insert a single keyframe. And now if we just scrub through this timeline, you can see the moon rises and sets as we scrub backwards and forwards, okay? So going backwards, now we want to have the sun setting and then going backwards and arcing through the sky at noon and then coming back down and below the horizon for sunrise, okay? So as I'll play this back through forward as we get done with this, and you'll see how it works. But so after the sun has gone down and before the moon starts rising, I want there to be a little bit of a pause. So I'm going to skip a few keyframes, get down to about 85 right here. And then what I want to do is I want the sun to set over here on the left and rise over here on the right. So I'm going to switch in the top view over here. I'm going to pull the sun, in this case, over to a good starting position in this part of the terrain and the horizon over here. And now that that's where it's going to set, again, we're going to keyframe, but this time we're going to keyframe all 3 of these. So to do this, all you have to do is pick one of these, right click, and instead of insert single keyframe, we're going to insert keyframes, okay? It's going to tag all 3 of these with keyframes. And then we can go all the way to the beginning of our animation, frame 1. And if you want to scrub through with your keyboard, you can use the right and left arrows on your keyboard to go through the frames one by one. And I want to move this over so that it's going to rise on this side of the screen over here. Okay, so I can still see a little bit of it back here, which means we need to drop it a little bit lower. And now let's right click on any one of these channels and insert keyframes. So now you have little yellow keyframes on all of these areas on the timeline. And if we just scrub through, you'll see what happens as this moves up and down. Okay. Now I noticed that we also accidentally moved the X position of our moon over for where the sun is setting, and it's rising behind the trees now. So let's go ahead and fix that. So we'll go to the beginning position of where the moon is going to rise over here. Let's pull this over in the X axis to right about here. And I'm just going to keyframe the X channel right there. And then I'm going to do the same thing over here. Just to be safe, we'll keyframe the X position over here as well. So there's no way that's going to move around. Okay. Now we're missing the part in the middle of the animation where it's up in the sky. So now I need to pick this middle part of the animation over here. And I need to bring this up to the highest position in the sky where it's going to be arcing over top. And this is going to be kind of like noon or midday. Okay. Pull this back a little bit over here. And once we have a good position, we're just going to keyframe all three of these. And now we should have a pretty consistent arc, just like this. And then it's going to quickly move the starting position of the moonrise over to the right, so that when it comes above the horizon, you're going to see the moonrise. Okay. Now, I don't like how this is sort of going through the terrain over here in the back, the ground. So let's pull this back in the Y-axis and then keyframe this Y position here. Now I'm on frame 90, which is the very beginning of the moonrise. So we'll insert a single keyframe. And there we go. Now it's going to stay in the same place. So here we go. And then it goes up. All right. So yeah, again, this isn't going to be realistic. This is cartoonish. Pay no attention to the fact that, you know, the sun would obviously arc directly overhead. If our camera was pointed this way, we probably wouldn't see the top of the arc of the sun. And it's not realistic. That's not the point. The point is, you know, again, we're creating the first animation and trying to learn how to create something smooth and something that looks good. Okay. So once you have this, we can start talking about why things are working the way they're working. And let's talk about how to polish this up a little bit. All right. So just to kind of test this out, we'll scrub to the middle here, and we might turn on our render to see how this is looking. Scrub to the right over here. You see this rising now. Okay. Now, there's a lot of things we need to change and animate as well, besides just the position of this light, because right now this is supposed to be sunlight and it's not looking like that. It's looking like moonlight because we haven't animated any of these other objects in the scene. But we're going to work on that. So let's talk about first how to make this look like it's daytime instead of nighttime at the very beginning of our animation. And so I'm going to actually go to the middle of where it's the highest position in the sky for our sun. And let's jump into our world settings. And the first thing I want to do is I want to change this background color so that it is actually sort of a brighter blue, right? Because it's sort of a blue sky in the middle of the day. And we need to keyframe this just like we've been keyframing all of this stuff. So we'll jump to the very end after the sun goes down and the moon is about to rise. We want it to start being this color. So I'm going to right click on this color right here. I'm going to insert a keyframe. I'm going to pull back to somewhere in the middle of the sky over here. And then I'm going to change this to a brighter color. And we need it to be a little bit less saturated, something like this. And now I'm going to right click and insert a keyframe to save that color in this position on the timeline. So now this will actually fade between a dark navy and a daytime blue, just like this. Now, this is also not going to be constant as the sun is rising and setting. So we need to create a few more keyframes for this color. So let's decide at the beginning over here for the first keyframe, we want the sky to be dark. The sun hasn't risen yet, and so it's gonna come down and it's gonna be pretty dark like this. And we might actually bring it a little bit more towards the yellows because that's sort of closer to where it would start. And I'm also going to change a few more of these colors throughout the timeline. So now as it rises, right about here, where we start seeing the sun peak over the horizon, this needs to be sort of an orange color. So let's bring over sort of the way this is looking here. Let's start with it a little bit more yellow for the sunrise and a little bit more red for the sunset, just as a stylistic choice. And then throughout the day, it's going to turn blue. And then towards the evening, as the sun is setting over here somewhere, we're going to change this to a redder color over here. Now, you don't want to go too saturated. You want to play with this a little bit to where it feels like it would be sort of realistic. So you can go a little darker, maybe a little bit more saturated if it feels better, or maybe a little brighter depending on what time of the day it is. So you just need to play with it a little bit. So pay no attention to the stars right now. We'll fix that in a minute. Pull this back. I don't want to go super pink, so I want to be aware of that as well. Maybe something sort of like that will be good. And remember, this is going to dynamically change throughout the entire timeline. So we'll start here, go up, go back down. And then again, as it hits dusk, it's going to go towards the blue over here. So by the time we get over to the beginning of the moonrise where it's pausing, I'm going to change this hue to where it's more towards this bluish purple over here. We'll keyframe that. So a lot of colors happening here, okay? And we also want to brighten the sky up. So after the moon starts rising, we're going to brighten this up to where the moon at its peak is going to have a little bit of a brighter sky. So maybe something like this. Right click, insert a keyframe. There we go. So let's see how that's kind of playing out there. Okay. So there's a lot of things we still need to work on, but this is kind of the basis for how to get that going. Now let's talk about how to hide the stars. And so what I did before was I animated the stars kind of dropping into place, sort of in a cartoony type of thing. But what I might want to do now is actually just fade them out when they're not supposed to be showing. So let's make sure we know when our keyframes are actually on for the sun or the moonrise here. So I don't want the stars to come in until after the moon is kind of up in the sky. So right about here where the moon is starting to come up, I'm going to start with the stars all the way down to a 0 strength back here on the material. So let's turn this back down to 0 so you can't see them. I'm going to right click and insert a keyframe. And you'll notice like we can pretty much keyframe anything in Blender. If we right click and when there's an option to insert a keyframe, you can animate it. And that's kind of a cool thing. And so now as we get over to the latter part of the moonrise, let's turn this back up to 30 and we'll keyframe that. And now the stars will kind of look like they're fading in as we bring the moon up under the sky. Okay. Okay. So one of the other things we'll notice as we go back to the beginning of the animation is that we still have a lot of sun in the environment here. So the trees are still fully lit, even though it's dark outside, and that's not realistic. So there's a couple of reasons why this is happening. One of them might be that the strength is still turned up a little bit, so we could turn that down to 0. That's honestly not going to affect anything right now, so I'm going to leave that where it is. More often than not, it's a lamp that's still turned on, so we can select our sunlight over here. And what we need to do is start animating the strength of our sunlight. So not the actual object here of our sun, but the sunlight itself, the sun lamp, okay? So as we get to the middle part of the day where it's brightest in the sky, we obviously want our sun to be at its most bright right at this point. So I'm going to right click and insert a keyframe here so that it remembers that value. Let's go back to the beginning of our sunrise. And before our sun comes up, I want to turn this all the way down to where there's basically nothing happening in the scene. Right click and insert a keyframe. And we're going to do the same thing when the sun goes down all the way over here. So we don't want any bright green grass and shadows and all sorts of stuff happening when there's nothing in the sky. All right. So again, just to make sure we know when it's already set, it's frame 85 in my animation. So we'll go back to the sun lamp over here, turn this down to 0. And you see how that looks much more like dusk there. And so now when the sun or the moon starts to come up here, we can start animating this, this value again. So to lock this in position, our last keyframe was over here. So we need to insert what's called a holding keyframe at this position so that it doesn't start fading up early. So we'll right click and insert a keyframe there. And then of course the last keyframe is frame 100, and this should be back up to, let's say 0.5. Is that a good moonlit sort of fill there? Maybe a 0.25, a little bit darker than when the sun was out, and we'll keyframe that. So here we go, stepping through the animation. Comes up, goes down, dusk, and then this moon is going to come up just like that. Okay, now you'll notice that the stars are still out during the day and they're just black dots. So let's get rid of that. So the easiest thing to do here is to start when the sun goes down, we're at dusk. I want the stars to kind of start being in the right position in the sky. Okay, so I'm going to jump to this area on frame 90. I'm going to keyframe the position here, and we just need to keyframe the Z coordinate. And then I'm going to go back to frame 85, and I'm just going to lower the stars to where they're out of frame. And actually, we might go up here a little bit. And that'll at least make it a little bit more smooth, so they'll animate in as the moon is rising. Now, there's a more sophisticated way to fade those in where we're not going to get those black dots, but it's going to involve getting in and playing with shaders and cycles in the node editor. And so I don't want to do that tonight because it's going to take away from the animation topic. Okay, so let's just kind of leave it the way it is for right now and make do. And we can always go back and fix that later if you guys are interested. All right, we're doing good on time. Okay. So I know we're going fast, and I'm sorry that there's a lot to do to kind of even do this really basic animation, but I have a lot I want to share with you guys tonight, so we can get all the way to rendering. Okay, so let's think about anything else that we have left to kind of play with that we want to animate here as we're getting into our scene. One of the things we haven't touched yet is the shadow position of our light source. So all throughout daylight and nighttime, the shadows are in the same place, and that wouldn't be realistic if the sun was moving through the sky. So we need to work on that. So you'll notice the shadows are still in the same position, no matter where the sun is in the sky. So here's how we're gonna fix that. And this is a little bit more advanced, but bear with me. And if you guys have any questions, I'll explain it. Basically what we wanna do is we want to animate the position of the sun lamp so that it spins and rotates as it's moving through the scene, okay? There's lots of ways to do this, but we're just gonna do it by hand because it's the fastest and easiest way to do it. So one of the questions in the chat is, why did we get rid of the clouds? That was so that we could use the original, just regular Blender world material back here instead of having to use the plugin that we talked about last night. And the reason for that is that we would have to start keyframing every single attribute of all those settings that we were playing with last night. So we would have 3 more colors to deal with, 3 attributes for clouds, and it would just be a complete mess to get started with that versus just 2 attributes here for the world. So I decided to sacrifice the clouds to keep this a little bit simpler for you guys, so it would be easier to handle, okay? All right, give me 1 second. I'm going to... Okay, sorry. All right, so let's play with the position of the sun here. So let's start with the sun over where it's beginning to rise. And what we need to do is sort of point this towards the camera, and that's the easiest way to kind of describe the direction it needs to be facing. So from the top view, we'll start with it kind of like right here and just line this up with where the camera is. And I'm going to start with it on frame 1. And we just need to rotate the Z position or the Z rotation here for the sun lamp. So once we have that locked into place, I'm going to right click and insert a single keyframe. And then as we get to the very end where the sun is setting, we need to rotate this to where it's facing the other direction, like this. And I'll right click and insert a keyframe, and then it should automatically switch directions of those shadows for us at the highest point in the sky, because we worked on the beginning and end positions, okay? And then when it gets back to rising for the moon, we want to make sure that we have our shadows back sort of pointing towards the camera again. So let's right click and insert a single keyframe. So there you go, you'll see the shadows rotating as the sun moves through the sky. And then you'll see it sort of casting the shadows towards the camera as it rises, which would be a little bit more realistic in this case. And that's the easiest way to get the sun, shadows, and everything lined up, is to use a sun lamp here. Now, technically, our sun object is still casting shadows, but it's just not bright enough to really make a huge impact in the scene the way that a lamp would be. And so I'm going to use both of them in this case to help kind of make this scene a little bit more realistic. Okay, so that's about it for setting up the basic animation for tonight. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about how to polish this a little bit and also how to render this out as we get in here. And then we can kind of, decide how much we want to focus on what. And you guys can ask me questions as we go to kind of help this sort of go the direction that you would like. So here we go. Putting the keyframes in position on the timeline is only one aspect of starting to animate. And so you'll notice that we don't have a lot of control over how these keyframes are interacting with each other, how the timing is affected, and we can't really change all that from these default screens. And so what we need to do is start playing with some of the Blender's animation editors, okay? So the easiest thing to do is, let's join those screens back together here. I'm gonna split this window vertically. I'm gonna open up one of the panels in Blender called the dope sheet. So don't be intimidated. I'm gonna explain what everything means here. But what you'll notice is all of our keyframes have been put on a timeline here, just like in the bottom, but they are selectable, so we can right click on them. And the dope sheet is a term that was used for two-dimensional animation back in the days when people were doing everything on paper. And so basically the dope sheet is basically telling you just the timing of animation keyframes and how they relate to one another. And so what's great about this is that once you've established your basic animation, blocked it in sort of like we already have, now we can start playing with timing in terms of how long it takes the sun to rise, how long it's in the sky, when the moon pauses before it rises, all that sort of stuff. And so this is all broken down based on the keyframes for each individual object. So under the scene, we're going to have the world settings, which is basically, if we expand all of this stuff, is the color that we keyframed right here. This will be outlined to let you know that there are keyframes. Any yellow outline is going to indicate that we're on an actual keyframe. Anything in between is going to be green. And so that's kind of how that works. So what we need to do now, I'm going to start rendering this, is decide if we like our timing. And so one of the things that we might not like is the fact that before the sun is coming up, the sky is already, getting fairly bright over here, okay? And so we might want to pull back this effect until the sun is sort of at the very lowest part of the sky. So to do that, we would just need to right click on this one frame right here, this one keyframe for this color attribute, and we can slide this over to the right, and that will keep the sky closer to this original value longer. So it takes longer for the sky to brighten up until the sun is in the proper position, okay? We may also decide that we want the sky to be bluer earlier. So let's say that we want the blue to happen over here. So at this point in time, it should already be blue. Well, now we can just kind of quickly reposition the keyframes to time it a little bit differently, and Blender will update that for us. Here, we might decide that we still want it to be blue, even with the sun in this position. So let's just duplicate this keyframe and put another version of this blue color over here. So I just have to hit Shift-D, just like we're in the 3D viewport, and that's going to copy a version of that keyframe, and I left-click to accept and put it right there. So now you can see these holding keyframes are going to have these solid orange bars, and that's going to tell you that those are the same value all the way across the dope sheet. So now there's not going to be a change in that blue color until we get past those holding keyframes. Okay. Might not want it to go that purple that quickly, so we can pull this over. And then it's going to really quickly go to blue. There we go. So remember, the dope sheet's basically just for rearranging timing. You can rearrange order and all that stuff, but it's just about how one set of keyframes relates to another. So you can really easily manipulate things in one place without having to kind of try to hack things together in the 3D viewport down here. So that's pretty much where we want the world settings to be for the color over here. Let's look at the plane. So the plane over here would be what we have keyframed over here. So I'm going to turn this rendering part off. Okay, so the plane is actually the stars. We forgot to label this, so let's label this stars really quickly. Well, now we can see that stars is what it's talking about here. So you don't have to expand all of these if you don't want to, but it looks like we keyframed both the position of the stars as well as the material of the stars. Remember that we fade the stars in, so that's going to be part of the keyframe set as well. And so we have to decide, which set of keyframes we're going to work on. You can really easily tell what's what because they all kind of line up in a grid right here. And so now we just need to decide if we're happy with kind of the way the rest of this is playing out. And then I'll talk to you a little bit more about how we can even further tweak the animation to make it look a little bit more polished. Okay, so I think other than the colors that we had to switch around and the brightness for the dusk and everything, I'm pretty happy with the way that everything's blocked in. So let's talk about how to sort of polish the movement of the animation now. So the dope sheet is one fantastic editor, but it's only going to let you play with the timing of the keyframes. There's another editor called the graph editor, and this will let you play with the dynamics of the keyframes and how they relate to one another. And so the best way to kind of show you what this does is just show you instead of trying to explain it. So we'll walk through this a little bit. And for any of these editors, it's the same basic navigation that you would use in the 3D viewport. So you can scroll on your mouse to zoom in and out. If you want to move around like this, you can just middle click and that'll let you scrub around in the X and Y coordinates direction here. And then you can also hold Control and middle click, and that will let you sort of expand or shrink the distance of the graph. And if you can't remember that, you can always just left click on the end of these timelines here, and that will let you zoom in and out as well. So there's a lot of options for how to sort of play around with the views here. So let me collapse everything so that it's not looking too confusing as we get started. This will only show you by default what you have selected. So as I change my selection, these curves will show up differently based on what I have selected in the scene. You'll notice if I click on the trees and select those, there aren't going to be any keyframes. The world is always showing because I can't select the world in the 3D viewport. So you're always going to see those, but there aren't any keyframes on the trees or the ground. Okay. There, the stars have some. And so let's talk about how to change the dynamics a little bit. Easiest object to show this on would be the animation for the sunrise. And you'll notice how it kind of feels a little bit unnatural, the way that it rises in a straight line towards the middle of the screen and then really quickly ducks back down towards the other side. And so we need to kind of make it a little bit more of a wide arc at the very top, okay? And so let's expand our graph over here. And we can see all of the channels that we've keyed so far right here, okay? These are the exact same things. And so we can check Z location, that's the blue, just like blue is the Z coordinate in every single other part of Blender. The curves are blue for Z, red is for X, and green is for Y. And so we hadn't played much with some of these, and so some of these will be a little bit flatter than the other ones. But let's get in here and see what these look like. You can also turn these on and off with these little eye icons on the left. So if I want to hide these, I can hide all of them just like that. And so the other thing we'll notice is that the worlds is still turned on. So if I want to hide all of those, I can hide those as well. So we get those out of the way. And now let's just look at our sun here. So I'm going to turn all of these back on. And these curves, these points on these curves are the keyframes that we created. And the distance between them is joined by a linear or a Bezier curve that is created, interpolated between those automatically for you. And so this is an area where we talk about why it's easier to animate in 3D, is because you don't have to draw every single frame in between keyframes. On paper, you would have to draw every single keyframe, every single frame between keyframes of the sun and the sky. All of that would have to be hand drawn. Here, Blender's gonna try to guess for you what that looks like. So here's the issue. We get up to the middle and we're just gonna kind of talk about let's talk about the Z axis right here. So I'm gonna hide the X and the Y. This is actually visually showing you the arc of the sun through the sky. So right here, it's at its highest peak. Right here, it's at the beginning, the lowest peak, and then it smooths into the sunrise right here. Now, that's not really realistic, right? The sun is constantly going to be rising and setting at the same speed because we are rotating at the same speed as planet Earth. So we don't need this to smooth into this curve. We need it to actually just straight line into this arc, right? And so what we need to do is we need to actually play with how this curve is shaped. So if you right click on the points here, you'll notice that in the middle you have a square, and that's going to be the position of your keyframe. And then on both sides you have what are called handles. And these are going to let you manipulate the curve in terms of how it's shaped. So if you're familiar with Illustrator or anything like that, Photoshop in terms of curves, it's the exact same idea here. This is how you manipulate the curves. And there's a lot of options to explore here, but tonight we're just going to cover some really basic ideas. And so there's a couple of ways we could get in here and play with how this is shaped. We could grab this right side over here where it's highlighted. And then if we hit G on the keyboard, we can pull this up to where that's one continuous linear action towards the top of that arc. And now you'll notice as the sun starts to rise, it's going to happen in a very linear type of fashion in terms of the up and down motion, okay? Now remember, we're just playing with the up and down motion. We're not playing with left to right now. To create the same effect, we would have to turn on the X curve here, and the same thing would have to happen here. You see how this needs to be a straight line? So we'll grab the right side and we'll drop this down a little bit so that this is sort of a linear line. And that means basically that the speed is not changing. We're controlling speed here, okay? I probably should have mentioned that a little earlier. And speed and dynamics are what we're doing. So as the sun is rising now, and we're playing this back at a constant rate, you can see how it's not changing speed until it gets over to here. And that's because we've now modified these curves to sort of be linear curves. So let's go to the end of this right here. We'll grab the left handle now, and we'll pull this up until, again, it's linear in nature. And now we'll do the same thing for the X curve over here. Click over here, and as it bottoms out from left to right here, it's going to slow down into the transition as it sets, and that's what we don't want. We want it to stay the same speed. So we're going to straighten this out just like that. So I hope you guys are following. This is kind of a little bit more advanced stuff, getting into the graph editor, the first night in animation, but this is how professionals really get in here and polish their animation, is the graph editor. And again, we're working big to small. First we blocked in, then we used the dope sheet to set the timing to get that blocked in. And now after we've done 2 rounds of blocking, we're going back into the graph editor, and now we're tweaking speed in between keyframes and polishing things up. Same method for when we model something. We take it slow and we work general to specific. So now as it's moving through the sky, you can see that it's going the same speed the entire time. Okay, so rise to set, it's pretty much going the same speed. It's going to slow down a little bit as it gets towards the middle, and that's because, again, this arc is slowing it down and then speeding back up towards the bottom. That's okay. That's a little bit more realistic in the sense that it does that in real physics. So if you think of the way someone would throw a baseball, this is exactly the arc that it would trajectory fly through the air at. So this is accurate. Okay, and then we can look at the Y curve, but there's not going to be a lot because remember, the Y is just going to be the depth of where this is. And quite honestly, this would pretty much stay at the same place. I'm not even going to mess with the Y curve, even though we could play with that if we wanted to. Okay, so now that we've got that in place, let's look at the rising of the moon. Now I want to create a kind of an interesting effect with this where it's a little bit more cartoony, the way that it happens. And so what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of a bounce with the moon as it rises. So when it comes up into the air, it's going to speed up, and then it's going to hit the top of its peak, and then it's going to bounce down a little bit and settle into place in the sky. And this is getting more into those 12 principles of animation that we talked about at the beginning. And so let's go back to the beginning of the moon rise over here. I'm going to zoom in on this part of the graph. And we're only focusing on the Z and the X. So this is up and down, this is left to right. We don't even need the X actually, because it's only going to go up and down in this case. So let's turn this off. Now let's just focus on the position as it rises, okay? So you'll see what happens. It slowly starts to ramp up. Right here, it steadies out at a constant rate and speed. And then as it reaches its peak, it's going to slow back down and settle to its place in the sky. There's not a lot of time in between those keyframes to see that happening, but that's what's happening. It's easing into the rising, and then it's easing out of the rising with a really smooth curve here. And we want this to be a little different, so let's play with this. So what I actually want it to do is I want it to ease into the rise a little longer. So I'm going to pull this over to the right side. And you can actually constrain the movement of these handles the same way you would with an object in the 3D viewport. So if I hit G and then X, it's only going to move on the X axis, as you can see here. So that's a little tip. And you'll see now as it starts to rise, it's going to take quite a bit more time to get up to the top over here than it did earlier on before. And once we get over here to the top, what I want to do is I want to actually pull this handle up a little bit, and I want it to bounce at a higher peak, and then I want it to settle back down in the place in the sky that it needs to be sitting in. So it's going to rise, and then it's going to drop just like that. Now that only has about one keyframe to work, so we're going to pull this over a little more to give it some more time in the animation to do that. You can see how that bounces up and then down. And let's just say we want it to actually rise a little sooner. So I'll pull this over in the x-axis to make that happen. And what we might also want to do is wiggle the up and down position even a little more. So let's just say we want to duplicate another keyframe starting with this position. So right-clicking on this keyframe, which is its last position, I can hit Shift-D and then drag out another part of this curve. And then what I'll do is I'll decide, I want to actually, once it goes up to the highest peak, I want it to drop, and then I want it to bounce down, and then I want it to come back up again before it levels out. Okay, so we have a wobbly up, down, and then back up, and you'll see kind of what this does now. Up, down, and up, and that's a little too much. And what we want to do is we want this to be softer and softer as it levels back out. So the curve needs to be a little less drastic as it bounces towards the end of its position over here, okay? Grab all of those, move them over. You can even scale these keyframes. If you hit S and then X, you can bring them closer together and further away from each other. Now you have to remember, we only have about 2 or 3 keyframes, or 2 or 3 frames between each of these keyframes. So it's not a lot of time to animate things, but you can see what's happening here. So if it's too low, let's pull this up a little bit. There we go. That's a little bit more subtle. So let's play this back now. And I just want to play it back between the beginning of the moonrise and the end of the animation. So what I'm going to do is set my start frame to frame 85. And now it's just going to loop between these two right here. So let's give it a little bit more time, all the way to frame maybe 110. So we actually have keyframes outside of that 100 frame animation now. And now you can see how the moon kind of bounces into place like a sort of effect. Now, whether you're using a cartoon or not as your animation style, even in realistic animations, people add these sort of bouncing effects to people and lots of objects, and it gives a sense of weight to the objects as they're moving through the scene. And so this is all about physics 101 and understanding that objects can't just be moving really fast and then just slam into a brick wall. They have to have time to slow down. They have to have time to switch direction. They have to have time to absorb impacts and all that sort of stuff. So pay attention to those types of things. If you want to learn how to animate, you need to be studying physics and learning about how those laws of motion work. But that's how that's going to happen. Yeah, so Lorian's commented, it's just kind of like the pen tool in Photoshop, and that's exactly right, it is. And we can actually even separate these handles if we want to create really sharp corners on these curves. To do that, you can hit V, and that will let you set the type of handle for your keyframe here. And so automatic is kind of what it's already on, just like this, or maybe aligned. So if you want to grab one side and just bring that up by itself to create a really sharp motion, you can hit V and select vector, and that will let you split that up, or hit V and free, and now you can individually move those around by themselves. And so again, just more advanced ways of getting in here and playing with these curves to finesse them. And the graph editor, if you want to become an amazing animator, is where it's all at, because this is where you need to be focusing on how to polish things up in a way that makes them believable. Okay, so let's set our start frame back to 1, and let's play this all the way through. It's going to rise and set, and then the moon's going to bounce into place. Now we could do the same thing with the stars if we want to create a bouncing effect with those as well. Those aren't really animating in the way they were in my original, So I'm not going to do that right now, but we could do that. And that might be another cartoony way to affect things. But yeah, I'm pretty happy with the way this is sort of animating. And there we go. So it's not going to play back in real time while it's rendering in the viewport here, but you can scrub through the timeline and see each of these update on individual frames. And there you go. Okay. All right, so we've got about an hour left. I'm going to get into talking about render settings and how to create a final animation. All right. So let me get a quick drink of water. I'm going to pause for 1 second and I'll be right back. All right. All right, guys, I'm back now. Hope you guys had an awesome 5-second break. So let's get back into the scene here. So if you guys have any questions so far, I know we've covered quite a bit already, but you know, there's a lot I can kind of get into depending on where you guys take the questions. So just let me know in the chat if you have something that you want to talk about, and we can get into something. Okay, so from back here at a different viewpoint, you can see how this animation is sort of playing out here. All right, so let's talk about how to make the render look a little better, because right now we are rendering at 20% in terms of the size, and if I render really quickly, it's going to kind of look gross, right? Well, first of all, I'm on frame 0 back here, so it's not going to show you anything because we don't have any lighting in this part of the animation. So I'm gonna hit escape. But if we were somewhere towards the middle over here, we hit render and kind of show you what this is looking like so far. Okay, so I talked a little bit about when we started off tonight that I would show you some tricks for optimizing the render. One of the things I'm gonna do is turn the size up so it's a little easier for everybody to see here. And we're going to get into some of these render settings for cycles specifically. So one of the things you want to do, if you haven't done this yet, is go to the user preferences under File, go to your system settings right here, and then depending on whether you have an NVIDIA graphics card or an AMD graphics card, you can select either CUDA for NVIDIA right here or OpenCL if you have an AMD card. If you don't have any of those options, that's fine. You can just make sure this is set to CPU rendering under device and you'll be good to go. But if you do have either CUDA or OpenCL right here, and then you have some graphics cards listed out, you want to check those off because that will speed up the rendering quite a bit for you when it comes to rendering with cycles for most settings. And then you can just save your user settings and that will remember that for you. Okay, so you'll notice that it's looking okay. There's a lot of noise right now in the scene, and of course it's kind of slow. And so let's talk about why that is happening. If we look at all of these settings over here, there's tons of things we can get into in terms of why this is going on. But let's take it from sort of top to bottom. So remember, GPU is what you want to have this on if you have the option. We can leave all these other settings alone right now. This is your render output resolution. So right now I'm using a full HD screen, which is 1920 by 1080 pixels in size in terms of width and height. So you can set this to whatever you want. And right now it's rendering a 50% render of this full resolution, if that makes sense. So you can set this to render just a percentage here, hit render, and it will shrink that down for you. So it's not rendering full size. Of course, you know what the start frame and end frame is. That's the entire range of our animation. Frame step needs to be at 1. That's going to tell Blender that you want it to not skip any frames between playback. So we want to keep this at 1 for the frame step. And we can leave border rendering on if that's what you're using. We talked a little bit about frame rate last night. 24 is for film. 30 is for TV if you're in the US. Anywhere else in the world, it's 25 frames per second. And so that's something handy to just put in the back of your mind. But let's get into some of these other settings here that are important for you guys. I'm going to set this back to 50% for resolution. Output right here is going to be where Blender is going to save your animation or your renders, okay? So, and what I mean by that is I don't mean when you hit render, because it's not going to save this anywhere on your hard drive when you render this, okay? It's just going to give you a render, and it's going to be in your system memory while you have Blender loaded. So if I close Blender after this is finished, it's not going to save it anywhere, and that's important to know. In order to actually render something to your hard drive, you have to use the animation button. And so, like you might think, if you only want to render one frame or for a single 3D illustration, like most people would want to do if they're not animating, you would want to set this to the same frame number for start frame and end frame, because that's going to let you only render one picture, okay? But in our case, we want to render an entire animation. So now when we hit animation, it's going to save it at this directory on our hard drive. So one of the things you can do if you've already saved your Blender file somewhere on your hard drive is if you just type in 2 forward slashes right here on your keyboard, that's going to save it in the same directory as your Blender file right here, okay? So you can see I've already rendered out a couple of animations here, and because I'm using those 2 forward slashes, it's going to save it in that same directory as an animation. And let's talk a little bit about options for how to save animations out of Blender. Right under the output section for the file path where you save, it's going to ask you what type of image format you want to save your renders. So right now we have it selected as PNG, and what this means is that for every frame of my animation, if I hit this animation button, it's going to save a PNG with a frame number in this directory. So it would save 110 frames for every frame of the animation, okay? So frame 1 would have a picture, frame 2 would have a picture, frame 3 would have a picture. And basically what you would do after that is you would take all of these individual images into a program like Adobe Premiere or Final Cut on Apple, and you would edit those together in one continuous movie, okay? So that's how traditional film would work, and typically that's how most 3D people render their stuff. You do have options here to select movie formats like AVI or MPEG video. I would highly recommend you don't use these, and there's a very good reason why. Let's say you start rendering a really long animation, and depending on your system, it may take you lots of time, lots of hours to render this out. Just for this 50% resolution animation today, it took my computer about an hour and a half. So in order to not lose all of that time, if your system crashes, which it will inevitably when you start rendering at some point, you want to render these all out using individual image files, okay? And what that will do for you is if your system for whatever reason crashes because of a power outage, or your screensaver kicks on and for whatever reason locks it up, and inevitably that'll happen. It's happened to me hundreds of times. You can go back and it will already have saved individual files in that directory up until the last frame where it crashed. And then you can just tell Blender to start on frame 56 or whatever, pick up where you left off, and then start rendering again when you reboot your system. That can't happen when you try to save that as a movie file, because it won't save the entire movie file till it's 100% finished rendering everything. And so that's a really important lesson to take away from tonight's stream, is make sure you're rendering your animations to image formats. Doesn't matter whether it's JPEG or PNG or whatever you want to get started with. I would highly recommend JPEG. It's a pretty low impact image format on your hard drive. So if you have hundreds of frames, it's not going to kill your hard drive space. I typically render to OpenEXR because these are considered raw formats. Which we can get into in another evening, but that's sort of the highest quality you can get when you render out animations. And so there you go. This is going to ask you whether you want to render out in black and white, regular RGB, which is red, green, and blue for all the colors that you see here. And RGBA is if you have any transparent sections of the background, that's going to save those as well. So remember, it matters which image format you pick for this. So if you want to save transparency, you have to pick an image format that supports transparency. So you can't use JPEG. You're going to have to use something like PNG or Targa, but that is an option. Color depth, which isn't really going to matter at this stage, and then compression, and we won't talk about that either. Okay, let's talk about something that actually matters down here, which is sampling. Sampling is going to tell Cycles how accurate it can be when it's rendering these images for you, okay? So as we talked about, there's a lot of noise as we zoom in on this that you're going to see right here, and that's because we have our samples set to something like 128, all right? If we set this even lower to something like 32 for our render samples, and then we hit render, this is 100% right here, you can see we have even more noise. Before I zoom in, you can see it, okay? And so the lower you make these samples, the more noisy your image is going to be, because these samples are telling Cycles how many times to bounce light around the scene to try to get an accurate image created for you, okay? So it's basically only bouncing 32 rays of light around the scene. Now you can turn this up quite a bit to whatever value you want and your system can handle, but there's some tricks in terms of how not to have to do that I'm going to talk about tonight. All right, so even with 32 samples, we've got a lot of noise here that's visible, and Blender has had a new feature that's been added fairly recently that we're going to talk about right now that's called denoising. So this will save your butt if you are rendering with lower samples because your system can't really handle higher samples. And so let's jump over to the Render Layers tab here. At the very bottom of the screen of this panel, you're going to see this denoising checkbox. So I want you to check that off, and we're not going to play with any of the settings in here right now. But let's just check off the denoising and leave it at the default settings. And now let's save this render in slot 1 right here. And I'm going to select a new slot, slot 2. And now with denoising turned on, if we render a sample with the same number of samples of 32 here, you're going to see something interesting happen as we switch back and forth. So I'm going to let this render, and then we can talk about kind of what's going on here. Okay, so it may look like it's taking a little bit longer, and that's because it's going back on each of these tiles that it's rendering out, and it's denoising each of those tiles. So as I zoom in a little bit here, you'll see some of these tiles have already been denoised, and these have not been denoised. And so if I jump back and forth between these two renders, this is the one that has no denoising turned on, and this is the one that has denoising turned on. And you can see, even though we have the same settings here, just by turning that feature on, we've cleaned this up quite a bit. It's almost like magic, okay? This is a brand new feature, a few months old at this point, and it's fantastic. It's not the silver bullet that's gonna save you in every situation, because there can be artifacts that are introduced because of it, but it will be an incredible feature if you have a system that's not super powerful right now. So just by switching back and forth, again, you can see all the noise in these areas, okay? So that's denoising turned on, which means we don't have to crank this up to 128, which is what it was at. We can actually lower this even more if we want to try to speed the render process up a little bit. So let's take it down to 8 samples and see what that looks like. You will notice as you lower the samples that Blender will render faster. So that's the obvious advantage. Now there will be a moment where the samples are low enough that you're going to have artifacts start appearing in the shadows, as you see right here on this tree. But it depends on what kind of scene you're rendering. Some scenes, if you're moving quickly through a scene and there's a lot of motion blur, you may not see any of this. So it all depends on the shot that you're creating. So there we go. So this looks like it might be an acceptable setting to use for rendering in this particular case. And if you want, you can take this all the way down to 1 sample which will render this very quickly and try to denoise this for you. But you're going to start noticing problems as it can't really compensate for not bouncing enough light around the scene. So you can see things happening here and all sorts of problems. So let's leave this at about 8. And let's talk about some of these other things here. So for right now, just remember that you have 2 types of samples. You have rendering samples, which is for when you hit this render button right here. And then you have preview samples, which is when you are rendering in your 3D viewport. So if I hit escape and go back into the camera view here, and then I start rendering this with Shift Z, you'll notice up here it's going to say path tracing sample up to 32 out of 32. And that's telling me that it's using this setting right here. So if I want to lower this, I can lower it down to 4. And now it's only going to use 4 samples in the 3D viewport. So if you notice that that is giving you problems, you might want to lower your preview samples down here. And that can also speed up animation playback if you were trying to play back animation in real time, just like this. Okay? So there you go. All right, let's talk about some more of these. One setting you want to be aware of if you're going to do an animation is this setting right here that says seed. Seed is an idea of what Blender is using to generate random noise for when it renders your scene. So noise is inevitable. No matter how high you set the sample rates, you're going to get noise at some point. And so the idea is to use this setting to help you maintain and manage that. So if you're going to render an animation, what you don't want is to have everything turned off right here, because it's going to give you static noise where the noise doesn't move. And that doesn't seem realistic, because film has noise if you use a film camera like they have for hundreds of years on blockbuster films, and the noise dances around in each frame has a different pattern of noise that dances around, right? So in order to make this dance the same way as you would have on a real film, you need to check off this stopwatch icon right here. And that's going to use a randomly different noise pattern on every single frame, so that if you're rendering an animation, it's going to blend together a little bit more smoothly for you, okay? Okay, so we're not really going to talk about any of these other settings down here. You don't really need to know what those are in tonight's example. But just starting with a few of these boxes here, you can get in here and start rendering an animation. So let's talk about these settings one more time real quickly. We'll run through them and let's take a look at these. Hey, looking in the chat, Black Nibullion, good to see you. Glad you're watching on Twitch. So tonight we are working on animation in Blender, and we were talking about render settings right now. So let's run through this one more time. Remember to set your device to GPU if you have it over CPU, because it will speed things up. Set your resolution here for your output size. So 1920 by 1080 is HD if you want to save that there. Frame range here for your animation is important. Output directory is right here, so you can select this and pick a spot on your hard drive if you want to do that. Make sure you actually pick a spot or use those 2 forward slashes after you have saved your scene. Otherwise, it will by default save your animation to a folder on your hard drive called temp. And if you don't know where to look, that can be harder to find. So remember to change your output directory. Make sure you set this to some sort of image format so that every frame of your animation is saved to an image file like a JPEG. And then we can leave all these other settings the way they are. Set your render samples to what they need to be, and turn the stopwatch on for the noise patterns to change on every frame. And the last thing we need to check off is our denoising down here, which is really important to save your render time. Okay, so let's jump to another section here, render a preview frame. All right, so you're gonna notice that as we have scrubbed through and gone to our starting night sort of point in time on the animation, that things are looking a little worse than we thought, because the denoising based on 8 samples is not going to work with the starry night sky. So this is a good point to bring up, in that you need to make sure you're testing your settings for different parts of your animation as you go. Because if you are over here and you assume that everything's good for the rest of your animation, then it can lead to problems that you didn't catch at the render stage. And it would be very hard to go back and fix this in post by hand. And so it would be much better to just do this right now. So to fix this, we can crank our samples back up a little bit more, maybe to 16, and see how that looks. This is essentially happening because of our denoising settings that we have turned on over here. So we can also play with some of these settings. The radius is going to be how many pixels across it's trying to denoise at one pass for each of these sections. So again, you can read the tooltip here. Size of the image area that's used to denoise a pixel. Higher values are smoother, but might lose detail and are slower. So we could try to lower this down to something like 2 across. See how that looks. That's looking a little better as we see that it's already started to clean up some of those stars back there. And the only other thing we need to look at is if it's still cleaning up these trees in a way that's working for us. Now, right now, we're seeing a little bit more noise in the scene, and that's because for the nighttime section of our animation, there's not a lot of light bouncing around the scene. And anytime there's a lot less light in cycles, you're going to get more noise because it's harder for cycles to figure out how to smoothly shade things. Light is good. And so when in doubt, make sure you have everything lit appropriately. So in this case, we have some options. We can raise our render samples even more. Perhaps we're okay with the way this looks. If the noise is okay for us, we don't have to change it. But we could, again, up this to 32 and see how this looks. One of the other things you can do if you just want to test a section of your background here instead of rendering the whole thing over and over again is to use this border option and manually draw a border here for Blender to use. So by default, it will check off the entire render section of your camera, but there's a keyboard shortcut, which is Shift-B, which will let you draw a box for a portion of the screen to render. So now if I hit Shift-Z, it's only going to render whatever is in this box. Okay, so Shift-B is down here. You can see that. And this will work for the preview and your camera view as well as the render itself. So if we try to render this, it's only going to render that one little bordered area. And I use this quite a bit for when I'm playing with cycles materials to get those working a little better and speed through some of the changes to my settings. So I turn the border up a little bit to 4. Let's see what will happen if I go. So that's still affecting the stars in a negative way. I could pull this up to 6 and then just bring the strength down. And let's see what that does. Okay, so that may be a little worse. So now we just need to go back the other way and decide what settings are optimal here. And it may take you a while to play with these to get them dialed in, but it's a pretty important thing to get right if you're going to use this setting. So strength is not really doing what we need. You try feature strength, pull this down a little bit. Try this again. Okay, still not giving us what we want. So let's try the other way, see if that changes anything. Okay, so a little bit different of an effect here, and we might decide that we actually kind of like the way it's making the stars glow in a sense. So we play with that. Relative filter, when removing pixels that don't carry information, use a relative threshold instead of an absolute one, can help to reduce artifacts, but might cause detail loss around edges. So let's try this and see what that does. Might help in our situation, we never know. Ew, not liking that. Okay, so let's turn that back off. You also have the option here to turn off the denoising for specific parts of your render. And so I'm not gonna get into what all these mean, but you can have a lot more control over the denoising at more advanced levels as well. So something to be aware of there. Okay, let's go back to a full preview and see how this is looking. So what that's kind of doing, which is a little interesting, is giving us a bit of a softer glow around almost everything. And I don't know if I like that or not, but it's kind of interesting. I was wondering if we should go back and add some sort of glow effect anyways. And this is, interestingly enough, a little hacking, a quick hack to make this happen for us. So I kind of like what I'm seeing here. It's a little strong, but interesting. The shadows are really soft at this point, so I like that. Okay, let's save this. All right, so at any point in time, if you're ready to start animating, all you have to do is double check a few things and then we can get going. So again, make sure your output size is correct. Make sure you've set a directory on your hard drive that's correct. Make sure your samples and everything are set correctly. And then all you have to do is hit this animation button and it will start rendering frame by frame to your hard drive to give you what you need. So at this point, we've kind of completed everything that we need to for this particular animation. And I'm opening the floor for questions if anybody has anything they want to ask me that is animation specific. We got about half an hour left. And if there's not anything else, we can make some more tweaks to the scene, or maybe I'll just end early. So I'm listening in the chat. Let me know what you're thinking, and we can keep going if you guys would like to. You guys got anything you want me to work on, or questions about what I've talked about so far this evening? I'm all ears. I can see the chat on Twitch or on YouTube or also on Picarto if you guys have any questions. So I'm listening. All right, so what I'm doing right now is I'm setting up sort of a depth of field type effect. So this is kind of cool, and thought I might mention this while we're playing with some settings here. Okay, so anytime you want to make your camera go out of focus, pardon me, you can use a setting called depth of field. And this works exactly like a real camera lens. So let me split my viewport here so you guys can see the render at the bottom. And then at the top, I'm going to move this little empty I've created for the focus distance. Okay, so right now, if I put this close to this tree in the foreground, you can see the tree is pretty much in focus right here. Let me play with this setting a little bit more to get that into focus. But I can also move this further into the distance and it will bring things out of focus. I'm going to turn up my viewport samples because we're not really giving it enough to create that blur. So let's select our camera again, go back to the camera menu. Let's turn our size up quite a bit. Okay, so again, my camera is right here. This is the first tree that you're seeing. So you can see the edges are in focus. And then I can bring this further into the distance. And now if I bring it all the way to the moon back here, you can see that the moon will be in focus and the rest of the scene will be out of focus. And so that's kind of an interesting way to add a little bit more realism to your renders. This is just one of many things you can do that will create a more realistic effect with your camera settings. There's a lot of post-compositing effects that we can do to add some more realistic things too, as well as more things that we can do to the animation, such as adding motion blur, and then chromatic aberration and all sorts of things to your renders. So the interesting effect this is sort of having is a tilt shift effect, which is a term used in photography for a type of lens that makes a landscape sort of seem like a miniature version of itself. And so if you've ever seen people take pictures of toy train sets or things and part of it's a blurred and then you know, part of the scene is in focus, you actually can buy a lens for your camera that will make any scene outside feel the same way. And so there's lots of pictures on the internet of people in cities taking photos with a tilt shift lens that has this sort of effect on the scene. And so if I pull this back over here, you can kind of see during the daylight a little bit more how this is affecting things. Everything in the foreground's blurred, everything in the background's blurred, and everything in the middle is in focus. And you can actually animate the focus as well if you would like to. So let's say we want to play with this a little bit. We can pick a starting point for our focus right here. And then we can insert a keyframe for the position. And then we can pick an in spot where we want to be in focus back here. And then set a keyframe. And now it will actually animate a focus shift. So we can start here. And as we get further along, it will shift the focus towards the middle ground. And then by the time the sun is pretty much setting, it is focused on the background. There you go. So that's kind of an interesting extra effect. One of the things I want to mention that might be important to some of you as you're rendering out animations is the idea of motion blur. So to use this, there's a lot, again, you need to get into learning if you want to be animating, especially when it comes to animating using realistic camera settings and things like that. So we already talked about physics and the importance of learning how that works. You also need to learn how to be a digital or a sort of virtual photographer, in the sense that you need to understand when we select a camera and we have to set focal length and clipping and sensors for all the different types of cameras that we have here. You need to sort of understand what all of this means. We have guides here for compositing and stuff like that. So again, it all depends on where you want to focus your time and your energy, but if you're going to be animating, I would highly recommend you get in here and start learning the 12 principles of animation that we talked about at the beginning of tonight's stream, as well as physics for animating and camera options. And you can start learning with either still photography or motion pictures and cinema, and it's sort of the same language. So there you go, guys. Motion blur, we can check off right here. And you don't really need to change anything, excuse me, as far as the settings are going. For default settings in Blender, the shutter can stay where it's at. So if you don't even want to open this up, you don't have to. just check off motion blur. And as you learn more about cameras and frame rates and how this works, you can play a little bit more with shutter speed and the rest of this. But motion blur will now be turned on. So as the sun is moving through the sky or the moon is rising quickly, there's going to be a little bit of motion blur happening on the moon. So let's find a position where the moon is kind of jetting through the sky as it comes up quickly. And let's render that really quickly. And I'll show you kind of how the motion blur is affecting it. So you can see how the moon is sort of being stretched and elongated like an oval. And that's because as it's moving up, it's sort of lagging and there's a light trail that's happening behind it. And that's typical of anything that's moving through the scene. All right, I'm gonna have to go because my voice is starting to get really scratchy. Thank you guys for tuning in tonight, and I appreciate your time. As always, I'll be back Wednesday through Friday of next week at 7 p.m. Central Time, and we will be talking about another project. So this week was Beginner's Week. If you want to check out more of the streams, they're all recorded on this YouTube channel that you can find. If you're not on YouTube, you can search under Brandon W. Hicks, or just type in Brandon Hicks on YouTube, H-I-X, and you will find my channel. I have over 30 hours or so recorded at this point, 17 or so streams that are all 2 hours a piece, and they're on varying topics. So check those out. Also, make sure you check out the Orange Guild, which I'll show you guys right now. So if you head on over to theorangeguild.com, you will notice our training platform. So if you want to get free training, you can sign up for our mailing list. That's free, and you'll be able to get a coupon for your first month. So that is there. You can also head on over to our membership or training sections to see all the courses that we currently have to offer. All the live streams after this weekend are going to be uploaded to the live stream Hangouts course that you can join for free, even if you're not a paying member. But if you want to become a member, just head on over to membership. It's an amazing sort of thing that we have going on right now. Unlimited 24/7 access to all of our courses. You can have exclusive downloadable assets for guild members, as far as Blender files and textures and all sorts of stuff like that as we start building things. And then, of course, we have a special Ask Mentor area. So if you head to the training section, you can see right here we have questions and critiques. So if you check this out under Ask a Mentor, you submit a picture, and we can actually give you handwritten notes back in terms of what to work on, how to fix things. And then, of course, we have questions, Q&A right here as well. So anything that you need help on with Blender or whatever, we can jump in there, and I will be listening 24/7 for you guys. So check out the blog. We got some interesting news popping up every now and then. And this is what I'm working on full time. So you guys, if you would like to see different kinds of Blender training, you can write me at support@theorangeguild.com. Definitely join the newsletter. It's completely free, and I'm working on a very awesome ebook for you guys coming up very soon. And it's over 30 pages long of 10 ways to level up your skills in Blender. So definitely want to check that out. So thank you guys so much for watching the stream tonight. Have a good weekend, and I will see you guys Wednesday next week at 7 p.m. for the next topic. Peace, guys.